My guest today is Professor Holly Ingraham, who is Professor of Cellular Molecular Pharmacology at UCSF. Her research focuses on the basic science of hormones and nerves in female physiology, aimed at improving women's health. Welcome, Holly.
Oh, thank you.
Yeah, first of all, congratulations to UCSF and David Julius for the recent Nobel Prize. How does it feel to have a Nobel laureate in the household?
Oh, it's quite exciting, but somewhat stressful because we're getting ready for the Nobel experience on December 8th. So lots of planning that must go on before that event.
Lots of planning, and I guess he has to give a talk, right?
Yes. He's sort of angsting over that, but I think it will be just wonderful.
Yeah. Excellent. So I went to your website, and your research has three focus areas. The first one you say is we want to understand why estrogen signaling in the brain profoundly increases bone mass. And you have a paper on this. You say central estrogen signaling coordinates energy expenditure, reproduction, and in concert with peripheral estrogen, impacts skeletal homeostasis in females. So this is, it's just a really interesting thing. So the brain is sort of mediating bone density, and bone frailty and osteoporosis is a big problem as females age, right? So what are you finding here?
Okay, well, so you bring up a good point. So it turns out that while women are living longer, we're not aging as well. And that's because if you think about it, like a disease like osteoporosis, many more women are affected by osteoporosis than men, many more. So that's a really prime example of the fact that while we are living longer, we're not living as healthy as men because of something like osteoporosis. And then there's other issues as well. So when we started out this project, we didn't set out to work in the bone. That was really by accident. It was a very accidental discovery when we were manipulating estrogen signaling in the brain. And we happened to have looked at these animals in what they call a DEXA machine, and they actually use this in the clinics. Like you'll go in and get for a lot of older women or even not mid-career, but middle-aged women will go and have a DEXA scan to look at their bone density. And so we do that in mice. Really, we weren't really trying to get the bone density. We were really looking at the fat and lean mass. So then we discovered that if we went in and we manipulated, we got rid of estrogen signaling in a certain part of the brain, that we got this increase, this really wild increase in bone density that was then not only were these bones dense, but they were much stronger as well.
So what's sort of the evolutionary basis for this? So the brain is doing something, potentially for the sake of some beneficial effects, but here it is actually creating a problem for the body, right? So what's the connection?
Well, I think you need to think about the brain as really the gatekeeper of how females are going to allocate their energy and where are they going to put their resources. And for a female versus a male, they have to make the decision, especially if they're pregnant and there's offspring involved, is are you going to put your energy into offspring, or are you going to put it into yourself? And so if you think about this, the brain is really coordinating. It's almost like a controller of the power grid is what we call it for the female. And so I think it does make sense that you're gonna want to control how much bone formation you're going to have at a particular time, because you're thinking about controlling other things, like, are you going to control movement for mating? Are you going to control energy going to your offspring? Are you going to control energy or fuel going to bone formation, bone formation is energetically costly. So you have to make this decision. The brain has to sort of make this decision about where you're going to put your energy. And so that is why we think this major axis or pathway exists between brain and bone. And others have suggested that this might exist. I think that our study really showed that it exists in a really big way, that manipulating the signaling in the brain can really have a dramatic impact on bone and bone formation.
So there is an energy budget, there's a resource constraint, and clearly creating bones E equal to MC squared. Anything that creates mass takes a lot of energy.
Yes.
But then the osteoporosis issues that we observe in modern human kicks in much later than childbearing timeline, right?
Right.
And so by then, is this energy optimization, is it sort of doing things because of habit that it hasn't really reverted back to what might be optimum?
Well, I mean, what you're asking is why when women age does the rate of prevalence of osteoporosis goes up. And it's sort of, it has been generally thought that that's because you undergo estrogen depletion. So at a peripheral level, estrogen seems to be really important for bone maintenance as well. And you can sort of think of peripheral estrogen being opposed by what's going on in the brain. And we think that this circuit in the brain probably kicks in much earlier during the prepubertal growth versus the loss of estrogen, peripheral estrogen later in life is important for bone maintenance. So I think, you have to, when you're thinking about all of this, you have to think of different life stages and what's going on. And there, you can't ever look at just one event and just map it to one life stage. You have to really be thinking about it over a timeline, if that makes sense.
Right. So do you see some sort of a therapeutic intervention here? If you go back and sort of retune the signaling process, could you restart bone formation?
So that is, of course, the hope, because we've definitely uncovered a novel pathway in terms of bone formation. And right now we're finishing up a study that suggests very much that this is some sort of circulatory hormone or factor that is causing this bone formation. And we are desperately trying to figure out what that is through different methods. But I think because our data do indicate that it's a circulating factor, there's some promise there that if we identify that factor and it's unknown or nobody has really thought about it in this respect when it comes to bone, that it might be useful for a therapeutic strategy. But of course, we're dealing with preclinical models, and I think it's always it's not wise for a scientist in a preclinical model to get out on a limb too far. But that would, of course, be the hope, that our research would somehow someday lead to better treatments for osteoporosis. And right now, I mean, the treatments are somewhat limited, and they have a limited time shelf, they limited shelf life. So that has been one of the big issues, because the body is really good at anytime you perturb the system, there's compensatory events that occur. And that's really been sort of this problem with any manipulation, that our current manipulations in terms of trying to treat osteoporosis is that they do really well for a while, and then you have these compensatory mechanisms coming in that limit the effective shelf life of some of these treatments.
And obviously, from a therapy perspective, side effects or unforeseeable side effects always a problem.
That's always a problem. That's always a problem.
And so the mice models, have you been able to successfully do this?
With what?
So in the mice models that you talked about, really sort of retuning estrogen signals, mice have been able to build back up bones?
Well, I think so. We've done one experiment that's quite interesting where we've taken a really old bones from females that are the equivalent of a 65-year-old. I mean, that's not so old today, but the bones have really gone way down in their bone mass. So they really are aged bones. And we've been able to put them back into these mutant mice and stitch them really in the back. We implant them in their back, and we build those bones back up. So clearly we have something that is building bone back up. And the other thing that we're looking at, of course, is how dietary excess, like high-fat diet, how it might affect this phenotype. Does it interfere with this phenotype? And if so, how?
Do you see other models? So I don't know what the next preclinical model might be, dog, or do you foresee anything going in that direction? No.
No, we have enough on our we have enough to do with mice, so that will be left for some other lab in some other place, like UC Davis that works on dogs. You know, that would be the perfect project for them. And I do think that taking one's science into other models is great, but I won't be doing it.
It sounds very promising, though, as this problem is really exponentially increasing as people are living longer.
Yes.
And it affects quality of life significantly. My mom has this problem, so I can, from experience, see the issues related to this. So you have another area, research area. You say we recently explained how surges in estrogen prior to peak sexual receptivity increase physical activity in females. So you mentioned estrogen depletion in rodents and humans leads to inactivity, fat accumulation, and diabetes, underscoring the conserved metabolic benefits of estrogen that inevitably decrease with age. Activity is also related to bone density, right?
Yes.
So this is another circuit, right? You call this MC4R signaling?
Yes. It's basically the convergence of two hormonal signaling systems, the melanocortin signaling and estrogen signaling, that converge on about 200 neurons in the mouse brain to then cause this basically when those neurons are activated and when the signaling pathway is activated, the melanocortin 4 signaling pathway is activated, activity occurs, an increase in activity occurs.
It's sort of like aging, isn't it? These circuits is basically, I don't know if the right term, but sort of shutting down, less activity, less bone density. It's sort of an aging process going on, right?
It's very much an aging process. And so, I mean, both of these projects really, their primary ingredient, of course, is estrogen, and looking at what just understanding how estrogen is really functioning in the brain in different brain regions on different subsets of neurons is a really it's challenging but so interesting to think about. And we really know very, very little at this point. I would say we've understood for many decades that estrogen affects brain function and cognition and neuronal activity, but we don't know how. We really haven't gotten down to the nitty-gritty of understanding that. And I think that our latest paper starts providing a molecular roadmap to understanding how estrogen is, how it's executing its function in those particular neurons. Of course, there's many other neurons and neuronal clusters that are affected by estrogen, and we have yet to really delve into those areas. And because this study took about 4 years, I don't think that we'll be looking at a few more, but we're not going to be looking at 10 more. So,
there's a lot of talk about reversing the aging process. People think that in 20, 30 years, we will find out how to live forever. And so this idea of reversing signs of aging is quite interesting, isn't it? I mean, it could have other applications in addition to this.
Well, I think, aging is such a huge topic, right? And there's so many diseases of aging. And you do think about, that when everybody thinks about aging, they think about things like Alzheimer's disease and dementia, right? Which are really insidious diseases that we don't really understand. We don't have a handle on in terms of any therapeutics. So our studies to look at, essentially we're asking, how does estrogen keep everything great and young and right and going as it should be? And so we're sort of looking at we're taking an approach that's quite diametrically opposed to, for instance, studying Alzheimer's disease, because we're saying, okay, what is it about estrogen that is helping to maintain a youthful state? And we think that by approaching that and understanding what estrogen is doing, we may come up with some pathways that intersect with the aging process. And definitely, what's happening when estrogen goes offline. And, this is not just an issue of aging, for instance. To give you, there's millions of breast cancer survivors that have to go through what we call premature menopause because they have to go on these anti-estrogen drugs. And when they do that, they're not going on them for 6 months. They're going on them for 5 to 10 years, usually right at a time when, so perhaps at the age of 40, when they have breast cancer, they're put on these drugs and essentially put into premature menopause a decade earlier. Then they might start going through menopause in 47, but it's really like about 52 to 53 that you have full-on menopause. So there's a whole 10 years for those women that they're losing the benefit of estrogen, and they're losing that for their metabolism, they're losing that for brain cognition, they're losing that for their bones. So all of these, this is a huge, huge population that we're talking about. So what is motivating a lot of our research is to try to find out, can we figure out what estrogen is doing in the brain to give these beneficial effects? And if we understand that at a granular level, maybe we can come up with new ways to bypass estrogen and then get the therapeutic or the beneficial effects of estrogen without having to give estrogen itself.
Yeah, so the aging, it all goes back to the brain, both in terms of cognition as well as physical strength. So it is sort of interesting. They say you are as old as you think you are. It's the brain that determines your age, really, not your body.
Well, I don't know. I don't know if I would. Some people would disagree with that, right? Because if your ligaments and your joints give out, you can have a brain that wants to move but can't. You have a body that can't move. So they're pretty interconnected, I would say. Your brain is really important for motivating you to do things like move, but you do have to have a skeleton in place that allows you to move and muscles that allow you to move.
Right. So in this in the mice experiment here, you have been able to actually create activity in older mice by triggering something in the brain.
I mean, this was an experiment that we did in collaboration with Nadav Atu's lab, where we actually go in and we do gene editing in those neurons to increase the dosage of melanocortin-4 receptor. So essentially what we're allowing those neurons to do is produce more of this receptor so that that's going to, once the ligand comes along, then by having more receptors on those neurons, those neurons can do their thing. And so we were able to really, it was somewhat remarkable that we took fairly old female mice and we went in and we did this gene editing, and we were able to sustain increased activity 4 months after we did the initial injection. So it's really quite a long-term effect. Now, whether you could ever use gene editing in the human brain to get the same effects, I think is sort of sci-fi stuff right now. But Nadav has really thought about this carefully, because he does think that for some diseases where we know that there's not enough dosage of a particular gene and that causes a disorder, it is a very interesting idea to think about using gene editing to increase that dosage, permanently or semi-permanently, to rescue the deficiency of a gene.
Yeah, so 4 months of increased activity in older female mice, what did it do to their lifespan? Was there any difference?
We did not age them. We needed to get those mice to finish this study, and we did find that their cortical bones were thickened because of increased activity. Interestingly, they did not lose the weight that we might have expected, right? Because the idea of body weight is that it's what's coming in terms of food and what's going out in terms of energy expenditure. And one way you burn energy is, of course, through movement. So we would have expected that their body weight would have dropped, but it really did not. And that's because they eat a little bit more every day. So mice are just, that's one of the beautiful things about mice, is their homeostatic systems are really robust, so that they don't get fat and they don't get skinny. They maintain their weight, unlike humans, which tend to get obese. So their movement, they know they're moving around a little bit more every day, and so they offset that by eating a little bit more food every day. So I think that underscores what some human some scientists who have studied human metabolism have known for quite some time is that it's very difficult to just lose weight by moving around more. And that has to be coupled with some sort of restrictive diet. But there are a lot of other benefits with exercise in your brain, your cardiovascular system, your bone. So it's not all about your weight and your appearance. It's also about your internal workings and if those are functioning at a higher level.
Yeah, this has been a little bit of a myth, right? You have to stop eating to lose weight. And so many of the weight loss programs that sort of focus on exercise and higher levels of activity never seem to work for good reasons. Yeah.
That's because people start eating more. And so, yes, it's nevertheless, I would just suspect that those individuals are healthier than individuals that don't exercise.
Right, right. So you have a third research area here. You say we wish to determine whether gut-brain signaling pathways exhibit sex-specific differences. An important question that may relate to the higher prevalence of intestinal visceral pain syndromes experienced by women. I don't know if this is related, Holly, but you have a paper, LRH1 mitigates intestinal inflammatory disease by maintaining epithelial homeostasis stasis and cell survival. Is that related to this area?
Well, there's another paper that we have actually that I published with my husband because he works on visceral pain, and I had a pediatric GI fellow come to the lab, and he wanted to work on hormone signaling in the gut and nuclear hormone signaling in the gut. And so he really helped start this project in the lab. And now he started his own lab at UCSF, which is great. And we're all three of us, including a group in Australia, we work as a consortium that's funded by these UO1 mechanisms out of NIH that are, it's the, I'm forgetting the acronym, but it's basically to look at pain and addiction and just mechanisms of pain, visceral pain, because visceral pain as well as pain in general is one of the big motivators for opioid addiction. So we have this grant to try to understand the connection between the gut epithelium and the nerves in terms of pain and that signaling. And so one of the reasons that I became interested in this is because we know that there's a large sex difference in irritable bowel syndrome with about 3 times more women. It's like a 3-to-1 ratio almost, with more women experiencing that syndrome than men. And we really don't understand very much about it. We just know that there is this, it's a really large sex bias for females suffering from this disorder. So we became interested in, trying to understand to see if estrogen signaling was in the gut, where it was, in what part of the gut, and if that might be contributing to this heightened visceral pain in females, whether we could model that in a mouse. And so those studies are just really beginning, but I think it's showing up that there are these regions in the gut where you get this pronounced estrogen signaling that's seen in females and not males. And so we're going in now and looking to see if you promote that estrogen signaling by giving them estradiol, what happens to that brain gut connection using a mouse model.
Right. Uh, there's a lot, so the microbiome, is it involved in any way?
Yeah, we don't know, but that's an interesting thing. I think, I mean, I do know other groups are looking at this, trying to understand if estrogen does affect the microbiome. And, if you think about this disease, you would say, well, why do females suffer more from IBS than males? And so one of the ideas is that there's this evolutionary trade-off in which, females are going to sense something when they eat it, they're going to have pain and maybe change their behavior, their ingestive behaviors accordingly. Whereas if males don't have this heightened awareness, then they would eat various things and there would be no consequences, no behavioral consequences. But males have a much higher rate of colon cancer. And so it could be that this heightened awareness or that heightened sensitivity in females is protective against colon cancer. And in males don't have that, and they have an increased prevalence and risk for colon cancer. It's just like the opposite, right? You have this trade-off.
Yeah, it sounds to me, Holly, that nature wanted to protect women because they are the ones who are making kids, so to speak. And it's sort of a resource optimization problem for nature too. So you let men eat anything they want, and let women be more discerning about what they eat.
We have another study where we're looking at this evolutionary trade-off between how fat gets stored in the liver versus susceptibility to infection. And again, it's sort of it's really remarkable because you have this huge difference between males and females I'm talking about mice now, I'm not talking about humans, where female mice succumb to an infection but don't develop fatty liver. And it's just the opposite for males. So I do think this, looking at some of this physiology in terms of evolution and why you would have this evolutionary trade-off lead to these sex-biased diseases is really it's really been fun to think about. I got started on thinking about this because my son had to take biological anthropology, and he had this book by I think his name is Lieberman, and I started reading it. It was so fascinating. Makes you think about things in a different light.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of information there. I mean, it's just, we have been around only for 200,000 years. So whatever happened 200,000 to 500,000 years tells us, I mean, a lot of this could have been mistakes, right? So nature trying to optimize evolution, random mutation, and you get selected for something and you picked up a bunch of, other bad stuff along with it. But it's always interesting. So I want to ask you in conclusion, maybe speculate a bit, Holly. I know that you don't want to go into human models yet, but do you see in the very into long time into the future, we might end up with some sort of estrogen pump, just like insulin pump, and we can program it to optimally release estrogen to different parts of the body, something along those lines?
That's an interesting question. I mean, right now, of course, you have hormone replacement therapy, and that comes in all different forms. You can take oral medication, you can have patches, skin patches. You can have, I'll just say it comes in different forms. And so I think that's a really interesting idea. Could you target hormone signaling to just one specific tissue to give you the advantage that you need and not affect other tissues that might have this proliferative response to estrogen, such as breast tissue or the uterus? in which case, there would be this potential for increased cancer in some women. I would say some women. This idea that hormone replacement therapy is going to cause cancer in all women is really, that's a really old notion. And it's based on a study that, a 20-year-old study that was somewhat controversial and somewhat flawed. And so I do feel that re-engaging in this conversation about reasonable hormone replacement therapy for women as they age, and even men, it's not an unreasonable conversation to have. But getting estrogen into a certain part of the brain versus, maybe medicinal chemists can start figuring this out, like how to. I mean, this is what drug delivery folks are thinking about, is how do you deliver drugs to just certain cells. It's not. I think that could be the future, right? You could target to certain parts of the body and specifically certain cell types.
Yeah, this seems like it's one of those things that if you have very good targeting, you can get very good results because it has a lot of countervailing effects in different parts of the body, right? And so is this research, Holly, very much in the academic setting? Are pharmaceutical companies really taken this up in any way?
Well, it will be interesting to see what emerges from pharmaceutical companies. Right now, all pharmaceutical companies are really just focused on how do you create an anti-estrogen so that you prevent breast cancer, so that you use it in hormone-dependent breast cancer. And the same thing is true for prostate cancer, for hormone-dependent prostate cancer. So the main focus for pharmaceutical companies has really been cancer. And so the question is can their mindset change so that they start thinking about hormones and the effects of hormones as drugs for aging? I mean, because really that's what we're talking about here. And it will be interesting to see if there's a change in the viewpoint from drug companies, because I think prior to the nurses' study that suggested that hormone replacement therapy was bad, the pharmaceutical companies were going full throttles ahead on hormone and hormone therapy, hormone replacement therapy. And then that just completely shut down all of those programs. Really, I mean, almost overnight. It was to me, it was such a rash decision, but I think everybody worried about the effects, so they didn't want to be, there's a lot of financial ramifications around that space. But I do wonder, as we start thinking about aging, whether there's going to be this resurgence in thinking about the use of hormones as anti-aging therapies. And that's already happening. I mean, people, women are going in and saying, you're going to give me hormone because I really can't think without hormones. So this is already happening at some level.
Yeah.
And
it's sort of a, sorry.
Men go in and ask for growth hormone and androgens as well. So
it's a bit for the individual, it's sort of a risk management question. We know that there are some beneficial effects. We know that there might be some negative effects. So where you are in terms of in your life, and I would imagine a lot of the family history. So, increasingly we are talking about personalized medicine, right? So if you really look at the individual more deeply, perhaps we can come up with an intervention that is custom tailored for that individual.
Yeah, that's a great question. And it's one that I think in this scenario, it really applies, because as I said, when that nurses study came out, it was basically one shoe fits everybody. Basically, we're going to not let you have any hormone replacement therapy. And that's just not, that's not accurate. That's not at all how we think about medicine today in terms of what you're talking about, which is personalized medicine. So I think as we learn more, we will understand who could be able to take hormone replacement therapy and who shouldn't be taking hormone replacement therapy. Or if we figure out other pathways that bypass estrogen, what individuals should be thinking about that sort of strategy. So we have a lot to learn before we get there, but I do think that I agree, thinking into the future, it's exactly that sort of stratification that one needs in order to deliver the best care for people.
Excellent. Yeah, this is fascinating research, Holly. Thanks so much for spending time with me.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.